Hey everybody, we're going to talk about chapters 7 and 8, the working class and American poverty. Now, the text gives a great example of the working class in chapter 7, where it talks about Julianne, who entered a prominent university, and her background was from a working class family. And she really felt that she never shared the sense of entitlement that many of her classmates felt. And she always felt insecure, always expecting to be discovered. And she says that she remembers how lucky she was to be, quote, allowed to attend a university. And Alfred Libreno, a well known writer, expressed a similar insecurity when indicating that in college he also suffered what was called imposter syndrome, and that even when he received good grades, it does not seem that they were equal to his middle class classmates. So this actually still goes on in today's world. I don't know how many of you have experienced it yourself. I know that I experienced it when I first went to college, where you don't exactly feel that you fit, not just personally or socially, but even academically, even if you were excelling. So let's move on. And so let's talk about that working class. Now, working class people in the class stratification system have been precarious. They're generally employed, yes, but often not economically comfortable. They're the kind of people who live paycheck to paycheck, as it's been said. They're quite restricted in financial, cultural, human, and social capital, and they've found life to be pretty difficult and demanding. And a lot of times, some of these occupations include craftsmen, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, construction workers, and retail sales workers. And on page 194, I wanted to include this here, that the working class employees have little control over the pace or the content of their work, and they are seldom someone else's boss. So remember that. It's not necessarily the people in management in these situations. They're still the people who are just kind of the employees. They're not anyone else's boss. Now, let's talk about the history of the working class. So, in the 17th century, working class workers were described as men who were sweat soaked in woolen clothes, trapped in areas made by torturous, fierce heat, humidity, mosquitoes, poisonous snakes, and they had blistered hands thanks to the axes and hoes and other tools that they used throughout the day. That was kind of how their days went. And a lot of times they didn't even rest at night because they had to grind corn into cornbread or hominy for them to eat. And a lot of these working class people were called indentured servants, and they made up 130,000 of the settlers in the 17th century, particularly in Maryland and Virginia, and 3/4 of them were single men between the ages of 15 and 24. Many were exchanging 4 to 7 years as servants for eventually their freedom. This was a payment of passage from Europe to the New World. A new set of clothes was given to them, a few tools, and eventually 50 acres of land. Doesn't sound like a bad deal, right? This was a great opportunity for these impoverished individuals, possibly their only chance to acquire such a large plot of land. Now, indentured servants, though, faced masters who forced them to labor long and hard and readily imposed them harsh punishments for any type of infractions. The result then was that nearly 2/3 died before their terms expired. So most of them didn't make it past that 4 to 7 years, unfortunately. Now, while daily existence might be physically demanding and unrewarding for some family members, they were less exploited and treated better than indentured servants and convicts, who ran away in droves, producing a steady stream of announcements about their escapes in the colonial newspapers operating in towns and cities along that Atlantic coast. So workers were oftentimes required to work up to 6 days a week from dawn to dusk in the winter and 10 to 12 hours a day in the summer. And actually, a worker's legal status became more important than that type of job that they did. Now, while Ben Franklin and others were saying that in this newly formed nation that it was called the land of opportunity, Many working class employees, such as laborers, seamen, artisans, shoemakers, and tailors, were actually propertyless. They had stagnant incomes and no occupational mobility. They could barely afford their own homes, and basic items like heating, fuel, and clothing were high and often getting more expensive as the days went on. By the mid 19th century, working class members were diversified occupationally, serving as either unskilled laborers, which are sanitation workers, custodial workers, farm workers, painters, grocery clerks, and assembly line factory workers. There were also artisans, which you can see that in the picture on the bottom right hand side. That gentleman is an artisan. You also have outworkers. These are contractors or employees who perform their work at home or at a place that wouldn't normally be thought of as a business premise. Outworkers are common in the textile, clothing, or footwear industry. And then you have your factory workers. On the bottom left hand side, that woman looks like she works in one of the automobile factories. So, a little bit more on the history of the working class. Between 1870 and 1890, 40% of industrial workers fell below the poverty line at $500 a year, and another 45% were barely just above that level. Now, this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that stated that assemblers and fabricators assemble both finished products and the parts that go into them. And as of 2015, they make around $30,000 per year, which equals out to $14.46 per hour. So even now, the working class is still struggling to make ends meet. All members of 19th century working class families worked hard. This included even children who had jobs in factories and other settings. They would start working around 12 or 13. Working class families didn't see it as important that they be involved in school as their middle class counterparts. Note also that immigrant families had wives that would seek employment. Note this is a big difference between them and the middle class. However, if it was a second generation family, they tried to go ahead and keep the wife at home for full-time homemaking. So she wasn't just sitting around, watching Maury Povich. This included gardening, making meals, hauling water, cleaning wood, and coal stoves. So one thing that Henry Ford initiated in 1914 was his famous $5 a day minimum wage. So if you ever wondered where the idea of minimum wage came from, it came from Henry Ford. Even though wages were rising at this time, working class families still could not make it. Wives started taking in other people's laundry, looked after boarders, and made clothes to make more money. They needed basically second jobs to make ends meet. Most families lacked indoor plumbing and lived in rundown rural or urban areas. And racism, unfortunately, was a theme within the steelworker community, saying that bringing together blacks and whites was inherently destructive to the Southern way of life. Now, I mentioned before that, workers went through some hazardous working conditions. Some more extreme conditions were that they were exposed to chemicals, petrochemicals, which caused lead poisoning, shaking violently, and hallucinations. They inhaled toxic dust that had killed miners and textile workers. You can see a picture of miners on the right-hand side. This is a real picture. They were involved, a lot of working class workers were involved in mining and working on railroads. You can see the railroad workers on the right-hand side. Between 1870 and 1920, there were cave-ins, fires, and explosions that killed 75,000 miners. And from 1890 to 1920, accidents led to the death of 86,000 railroad workers. So we talked about indentured servants, how most of them didn't make it through their term. It doesn't exactly say how long people, survived in this particular working condition, but you can see that there were an awful lot of people that were killed doing this type of work. So the text also talks about labor unions. It goes back a couple pages if you're following me page by page. It actually starts around page 189. Now, labor unions were formed, and a labor union is an organization that legally represents the interests of a set of job holders in respect to wages, benefits, and working conditions. Most of you have probably heard of a labor union. You probably understand what that is, but this is when it started. Workers would go on strike if they felt that they were treated unfairly. In the 19th and 20th century, most people would walk off of their jobs over wage-related issues. It was not worth it to them to not be being paid enough for the type of work that they were doing. Now, the commercial media has projected a hostile image of labor unions, that they're greedy, overpaid, and sometimes corrupted by connections to organized crime. Now, I'm not saying that that doesn't always happen, but a lot of times the commercial media has blown that out of proportion. Now, labor unions have suffered a decline in membership, but they've also become less militant thanks to government and management fight against these protests. However, they continue to provide their members better wages than their non-union counterparts. Now, unions, however, also possess a well-positioned opportunity to promote racial and gender equality. So remember that as well. Now, there's a big media portrayal of the working class, and part of that is talked about in your text on page 195, where it talks about the show Roseanne, where some working class members are seen as white trash, and Roseanne's family was a working class family that often described itself as trashy. At one point, Roseanne compared her family to old furniture, saying, "We're white trash and we'll stay white trash until they haul us out to the curb." You also have some of the examples of blue-collar workers, particularly men in various forms of low life. And the first one on the right-hand side is the life of Riley. And many TV actors portrayed these different lead characters. And another illustration of this is on the left-hand bottom side is bus driver Ralph Cramden in The Honeymooners. Then in the middle there, the gentleman with gray hair, you have Archie Bunker from All in the Family. Down at the bottom, you see I've got the quarry crane operator Fred Flintstone from the Flintstones. And on the bottom right hand side, I have good old Homer Simpson, the nuclear power technician. How he ever got that job, I'm still not sure. Of The Simpsons. And also your textbook had the great picture of Homer where, you know, he's eating a donut, drinking a beer. He's your typical or stereotypical, you know, working class gentleman. Now, Lubrano described different traits of blue collar life on page 194. He said that they had a well-developed work ethic, staying locked into a task until the job is finished. Now, Homer Simpson may be a little bit different on that one. They have a great respect for parents, usually obeying them unquestioningly. They have close relationships with extended family members who often possess the right to exercise extensive authority over youthful relatives. They have an open and honest manner without any hidden interactions and goals. And they have an appreciation of what it takes to achieve goals in circumstances lacking the extensive resources that middle-class children often possess. So one thing that's also looked at is working class development. Now, different than the other classes we've looked at, we know that social reproduction prevails in the working class. Now, they tend to be less successful in activities such as communicating with their children or relating to their children's teachers. And a lot of times blue-collar parents emphasize the importance of following rules and respecting parents and other relatives and elders. The middle class focuses more on self-direction, while the working class focuses on conformity, meaning that self-direction focuses on internal standards of behavior and conformity focuses on externally imposed rules. Also, for working class parents, their priorities have often been to maintain control and receive respect. And also, as a part of their child rearing, mothers and fathers belong to the class who often have resorted to physical punishment. Now, oftentimes the working class child hangs out with relatives, plays video games, watches TV, entertains themselves, and plays outside. A lot of times their parents tend to place less emphasis on the importance of planned activities and were less likely to have money to pay for those planned activities. Working class mothers and fathers were less likely to become involved in monitoring their children's institutional experiences. A lot of times the parents just purely did not have time to be overly involved in their education. A working class mom does not usually ask a lot of questions about her child's school performance either. Now, there have been a lot of changes in outlooks and behaviors of the working class, and you can go through those on page 197, but it's important to note that they have changed some over time. Now, again, as I talked briefly about, how they don't talk much about their education, working class schooling, teachers and other education officials were using physical punishment less in schools, while, as I mentioned before, the working class parents still widely used it at home. Working class families who accepted public education still had some issues with it. They felt that many students found themselves in vocational education. They were kind of put on that path without any other chance. The chances for working class kids to attend college was fairly limited. 40% of working class high school seniors wanted to attend college, but 27% took the SATs, and many of their scores were not good enough and only qualified them for a local community college. A lot of working class students, as in the example that we gave at the beginning with Julianne, felt that they were unentitled in affluent high schools and colleges. They felt that they didn't belong. Now, a sense of entitlement, if you're not sure what that is, I went ahead and put the definition, is the conviction that one deserves to receive some valued opportunity or reward. Now, it was noted that working class individuals did receive more support, generally financially and also from their educators. Now, one thing that's really important to look at is the working class community. Now, your textbook states that in this time period, in the late 1960s, that social gatherings and networks met at taverns for men and coffee clutches and church services for women. That working class families view social networking differently. It's more as a dirty word involving situations where opportunistic individuals make contacts simply to serve self-centered ends. I did write in my text, how much different are they than the upper class? Or are they? That statement right there, that second statement, is what makes the upper class meetings and social gatherings different than the working class. A lot of times upper class, they are, have some kind of self-serving into their getting together, and it may be a business or a financial meeting, where the working class don't feel that the same. Now, individuals with tools, skills, and money were more likely to use those resources to help others in the community within the working class. Now, this is true. It's an illustration that involved Eric Donahue, who had a good-paying working-class job in the municipal water system. Donahue's wages helped finance a small garage where he repaired cars. In exchanging information about car repairs with friends and acquaintances, Donahue developed a social network of individuals possessing a variety of desirable attributes, including skills, knowledge, and physical strength. Then, when he and his wife decided to build their own home, they contacted those network members. Donahue explained, "We needed sheet work moved one day, and it was a four-man job. We would just call people, and they would come." The people working with the Donahues in turn learned a lot about home construction that some of them were able to use in building their own houses. Now, one example of that I can give personally is that my parents live on a small farm out in a rural community. My dad has a backhoe and a bobcat. If you don't know what those are, they're basically farm machinery. They're not tractors. But we let our neighbor use their backhoe when a cow dies, and then they let us use one of their farm machinery in return. So it's kind of that give and take, back and forth. You have what I don't have, so, let's share it. So in that community, Sociologist E. Lemasters studied 50 men and women who met regularly in a tavern and found that the peer life contributed to the job satisfaction of these skilled workers. They had shared activities such as carpooling, working together in small crews, eating lunch as a group, and drinking beer at the end of the day. There was rich, often intense interaction, lots of practical jokes, and horseplay. So their social networking and interaction actually helped better their day after they worked or while they were working. So it was important to recognize that difference within the working class community compared to some of the middle class and up.